Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. Can I just start with an admin thing for our Zoom audience? Hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. If you'd like to ask a question, can I ask you to click your screen and you'll see Q&A at the bottom. And if you click it again, then you'll be able to type your question. Now, my talk is in three parts. The first part is to look at what Japan was trying to achieve by going to war at all. And the second part is the Battle of the Coral Sea. And the third part is the Battle of Midway. So let's start with the objectives. Why did they go to war? And the reasons look rather bizarre today. They needed to secure raw materials in Southeast Asia of oil, rubber, and tin. The concept of having to conquer a country in order to get goods from them seems rather bizarre. They're going to create this fanciful thing called the Greater East Asia Prosperity Sphere, which they would, by the way, control. They wanted to free Asia of colonialism. And of course, the countries they occupied had to benefit from Japan's idea of what their version of colonialism instead, which turned out to be rather brutal. And their objective was equally bizarre. It was to capture their initial goals and then negotiate a peace. They'd done this sort of thing, you see, with Russia and China before, but they're mixing with a different type of enemy when they took on the United States and Britain. Because these are countries that weren't likely to settle for a half-lost war and then negotiate peace. They either wanted it won or lost. And the timing was Japan was at the peak of its industrial power, and they were extremely aware that America had huge capacity, industrial capacity. And indeed, within 2 years, America was producing the equivalent of the Japanese Navy every year. So colossal capacity. How do they plan for war? Well, they assumed the enemy was the United States fleet approaching from the east. And so they had a series of defense lines. The first line of defense was submarines and land-based aircraft from their island strongholds, the barrier. The second line was fast mass destroyers, escorted by battleships and cruisers, and they'd be fighting at night with torpedoes. And well, I'll come on to that in a minute. The third line were the carrier forces to engage the enemy. And finally, they had a main force of battleships and midget submarines. They didn't want to commit their battleships early. They wanted to keep those in reserve and commit them at the end. Now, to prepare for that, they had to create this island barrier, and they fortified islands in the Marshall Islands and the Gilberts and so on, so that they were effectively little fortresses. They decided to make all their ships faster than the enemy ships, and they achieved extraordinary speed. Their objective with their battleships was about 42 knots, but they actually achieved 37, which is astonishing. They built a better torpedo. Their long lance torpedo was quite outstanding. It had a huge range, and it was fueled by pure oxygen, and it had a very long range, a heavy warhead, and great accuracy. They equipped their battleships with much heavier guns than anybody else. Brackets, this turned out not to be worth the money. They would have better to stay with 16-inch guns rather than developing the 18-inch gun, which actually never turned out to be a success. They had built superior aircraft. What was interesting was the West, I mean, the United States and Britain, couldn't believe they had the ability to build better planes than we could. And also, they upset enemy plans and exposed themselves to a minimum risk was their strategy. And of course, the fanaticism, I mean, going to war was a political thing rather than a military thing in Japan. And of course, they had this, well, Tommy goes marching home. He doesn't go marching home back after victory. He goes marching out to die. I thought you might like to look at this. Fighters. The Zero, which was the plane at the start of the war the Japanese flew off carriers, its maximum speed was 330. The Wildcat, which was the one the Americans were using, was slower. For your interest, I've also put the maximum speed of the Spitfire, Seafire, and Sea Fury. The Seafire was the naval version of the Spitfire, and you can see it was a bit faster. The Sea Fury was probably the best carrier-borne plane ever built, in a sense of being a propeller-driven plane. It was the Orca Hurricane successor, and it fought in the Korean War, and apparently took down some MiGs. Because of course you couldn't use jets on aircraft carriers at the beginning. It was pre-Harrier days. So the Sea Fury was the ultimate achievement of prop-based aircraft for naval aircraft. And there were, as I said, well, I didn't say, but it says on the screen, that all these planes carried, all these crew carriers carried fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers. So let's look at the dive bombers and the torpedo bombers. The dive bombers the Japanese had was a faster, although it didn't have the same range, and the torpedo bombers were faster than the Americans as well. Okay, so they had very good aircraft. Now, who were they going to fight? Well, certainly the Dutch and the British, because the Dutch and British had the colonies in Malaya and in the Dutch East Indies. Why America? Well, they thought that America held the Philippines, which is en route to the Dutch East Indies, and so they would get in the way. As it turned out, they didn't get in the way. The Japanese just went round them. But America was rearming, and so there may not be a better time to fight. And also, the doctrine of the Imperial Japanese Navy was the inevitability of a confrontation with the Americans. Of course, they achieved astonishing successes. In 5 months after Pearl Harbor, Singapore fell, Darwin bombed, Java fell, Sumatra fell. So they attacked Ceylon with a fleet of 5 carriers. The Doolittle raid is worth mentioning. The Americans decided to fight back, even this early in the war. And so Doolittle had the idea of bombing Tokyo as an example of the fact the Japanese weren't going to have it their own way. And what they did was they put Mitchell bombers onto one of the US carriers called the Hornet, which had a longer flight deck, which they could just take off from to bomb Tokyo. But of course, they couldn't come back and land on the carriers. So they ended up by flying to China. And from China, they were to escape through India and back to the States, which the pilots did. I have to tell you, the Japanese exacted a terrible revenge on the Chinese population that helped the aircraft. So it was a symbolic gesture, but a slightly tragic one as well. Now, what should they do after this initial success? And they looked at 5 options. The first one was a temporary halt. Well, I won't go through those. Let's look at why they turned things down. The temporary halt and prepare a second clash was quickly ruled out because they'd been so successful. So why stop now? The second option was to attack Australia with the Japanese army. Well, that was turned down by the army because the army was bogged down in an endless war in China. Secure the Southwest Pacific and neutralize Australia. Now that was logical. Capture the remaining Solomon Islands and so on in Samoa, and then that can be part of your barrier. Secure the Indian Ocean and link up with Germany and Italy. Well, that seemed attractive, particularly when they bombed successfully, they attacked Ceylon. But then the Doolittle raid showed them that if they put their carriers down there, they're going to be very vulnerable to attack from the Americans in the East. So that was ruled out. But they wanted to have a battle with the United States Navy this early in the war where they felt they were stronger. And so they decided what they must do in the Central Pacific was to lure the Americans into battle. And so these were the 2 options that remained on the table. Secure the Southern Pacific and entice the Americans into action. And the main plan was the Central Pacific one. Right, so, and you can see on this particular chart that for the plans of the Southwest Pacific was to capture these islands like Samoa, Fiji, and New Caledonia, and Port Moresby, which you can see at the sort of bottom end of New Guinea. They were going to establish a base at Truk, which is sort of at the top of the map in the islands. I can't pronounce Salomon or Ley, but that's opposite Port Moresby in New Guinea. Port Moresby next, and Rabaul is an island. You can see the sort of crescent-shaped islands above, to the right and above New Guinea, and Rabaul is in there. That's where they established a main base. And this would be part of the barrier to defend them against attacking Americans. Now, the plan for the Central Pacific was to attack Midway with 6 carriers, okay, and that's the bottom arrow, and to attack the Aleutian Islands as well with 2 carriers. Okay, right, but all these plans assumed that the enemy was going to obey their script rather than changing the script. And that's indeed what started to happen, because the US carriers decided they were going to attack Rabaul, but they were detected by the Japanese. So the Japanese decided to attack them and sent a load of bombers, 17 bombers from Rabaul to attack the American fleet. These bombers were not escorted by fighters. A pretty big mistake in carrier battles, because the Americans had radar from the Navy, and that meant that they could see them coming. 15 of those 17 bombers were shot down. I'm emphasizing this because it is a rule of this warfare that if you send your bombers in unescorted, they die. It's a tantamount to a death sentence. And that's a mistake the Americans were to make at Midway, as we'll come to see. The Japanese also landed in New Guinea, and unexpectedly, Americans had carriers in the area. So the Operation MO, by the way, this clever coding, MO stands for Moresby, MI stands for Midway, and AL stands for Aleutians. So the coding was not terribly profound. So it became quite clear that if they're going to attack Port Moresby, what they had planned as an escort carrier was not good enough. They had to send down a couple of fleet carriers to support it. And so they did that. What I've got said at the bottom is a slightly unwise division of resources, as you'll see, caused by victory disease. I mean, everything had been so easy up to now. Now, Operation MO evolved to become, this is Port Moresby, which led to the Battle of the Coral Sea, a 5-pronged task force. They're going to have, first of all, they're going to send troops to attack and land at Tulagai in the Solomons, and that was going to be one of the barrier islands. They're going to establish a seaplane base in the Louisade Archipelago. They had transports to land at Port Moresby, a light carrier to cover the landing, and 2 fleet carriers diverted from the Midway operation to attack the American carriers when they arrived. And it was the Carrier Division 5, which was regarded as being sort of the lesser of the 6 carriers. The Division 5 was the weakest of the 3 divisions. And you can see that the plan here, I don't want to go into detail, but you can see that the dotted lines are the invasion forces, and one goes to Tulagai, which you can see in white just above May the 3rd. I want to draw your attention to the red line on the right. That is the path that the Japanese fleet carriers took into the Coral Sea. And it is not what the Americans expected. The Americans expected them to come down the middle. So they had this in their mind. And as a result, that's where they looked for the Japanese. And they didn't look behind them when they got in. And they say the Japanese had exactly the same problem. They expected the Americans to arrive from the southeast, when in fact the Americans were already ahead of them. And the Americans were already in position, waiting there. So here's the order of battle for the Coral Sea. We can see that we've got the Japanese ship Shoho with 18 aircraft was an escort carrier. Okay? They had the 2 fleet carriers, and they had all the invasion forces. The Americans had 2 carriers. They had the Yorktown and the Lexington. They couldn't use the Hornet because, of course, the Hornet had been involved in the Doolittle raid, and the Saratoga was under repair in Pearl Harbor after having received a torpedo. You'll also see that there's, up on the right-hand side, although this is Task Force 17, 17.6 is the fueling group, which consists of an oiler, which is what had all the oil in it, and a destroyer. Now, Fletcher discovers that the Tulagai landings are coming on, and he attacks Tulagai with his planes. The success is pretty minimal. He managed to sink one destroyer, 3 minesweepers, and damage 2 others. So it was pretty unsuccessful, but it was quite a symbolic attack. Now, he was extremely lucky, because you'll remember that red line, which had the Japanese fleet carriers coming around the back of the Solomon Islands. The plan for that was that they would actually be off Tulagai to the northeast of it. And so they would have been able to attack the Americans straight away. But, of course, there's always a but. They were given 9 zeros to transport to Rabaul. And so what they did is they took these 9 zeros down, and the 9 zeros took off to Rabaul, but the bad weather prevented them from landing. So they came back to the carrier. So what should the Japanese do? Well, the logic is you carry on with 9 extra planes, but that wasn't what they did. They thought, oh, well, a day doesn't matter here or there. What we'll do is we'll actually wait till tomorrow and fly them off tomorrow. Well, same problem happened tomorrow, and it happened the next day. So it was by 2 days later, they're running 2 days behind. So they were not in position to support these Tulagai landings. So this is an example of the clever planning going a bit astray. May the 7th. Now, this is the day when, it's very interesting this, the Americans, because they're in the Pacific and there are no land-based aircraft, they had a tradition of sending out scouts of their own, often operated from cruisers, but Catalina flying boats and so on were used as scouts. The Japanese didn't do that. They always relied on land-based planes to do the reconnaissance for them. And so they didn't send scouts out from their own carriers. So we ended up with a situation on the 7th where there was only 70 miles between the 2 carrier fleets, and neither of them knew it. And the Americans thought that the Japanese were up there top right, and the Japanese thought the Americans were down there bottom left. And so a day of lost opportunities. Both carrier forces the next day attacked secondary targets. Why? Well, first of all, the Japanese expecting the Americans to come from the southeast, or some of them did. They sent out scouts there. They did send out a scout. And the scouts spotted 2 ships, which they signaled back as being a carrier and an escort. Well, they weren't. It was the oiler and the destroyer. And so they sent, 78 planes to attack these carriers, which weren't there. Of course, they didn't find them. And so they went to look for where the carriers were. They didn't find them. They came back and managed to sink both the oiler and the destroyer. So not a great success. The Americans weren't looking behind them. And so they were they received a signal that they're expecting that there are ships coming down the channel to the east of New Guinea. So they sent their attack force there. But they were luckier. They met the light carrier, which is very poorly defended, and so they managed to sink it. They sank it with the first few bombs, and it had 18 planes on, not a huge number, but a useful number. But then, tragically, after it had been damaged, all the planes that piled in after it, they delivered all their torpedoes and other things. And as a result, the Americans ended up with a complete lack of torpedoes because they'd wasted them on this paralyzed ship. I've got to say, this is a very confused battle with many things going wrong, but then most battles are, as I understand it. Fletcher, who commanded the Americans, also detached 3 cruisers and 3 destroyers, that's 3 CA and 3 DD, under Rear Admiral Crace. Crace was from the Navy, and you do sort of wonder why he did it. Was it to get rid of the naval admiral, who might be sort of a challenge to him or something? But he sent him off to actually guard the passage in case the Japanese came down that way. At least we'd have a force there, which sounds plausible until you think about it. It'd be far more use. I mean, if they had been attacked by carriers, they'd have had no defense. And it'd be far more use them being part of the defensive line for the American carriers. But at least they had something to show for it. Oh yes, here we are. The carrier Shoho was sunk, 18 Japanese planes, and the US only lost 3 planes. And here the oiler and the destroyer were destroyed. Overkill. Now the Japanese striking force, when they got their planes back, 78 planes back, decided to do, now they knew that where the Americans were, they decided to do an evening attack. But the Americans were hidden under cloud, and so they went past them. And when they'd flown a long way, it would have been difficult for them to get back to their own carrier with a full bomb load. So they jettisoned their bombs and came back. And of course, on the way back, they found the Americans, but by now they had no bombs. So that was a bit of good fortune. Because they launched 27 aircraft, they managed to lose 8 torpedo bombers and 1 dive bomber. Because the Americans again spotted them on radar and were waiting for them when they came back. Now, on May the 8th, both sides attacked pretty well simultaneously. But I can't tell you this thing simultaneously, so we'll start with Fletcher's attack. So Fletcher attacked with 2 groups of planes, okay? And it says here, it was an uncoordinated attack. I'm going to explain to you, when we come to Midway, how you're supposed to coordinate attacks to achieve success. But they did manage to hit the Shikaku by several bombs and effectively put it out of operational action. But their sister ship was under cloud cover and not seen at all. Okay, so 1 damage and quite a lot of planes destroyed on it. The Japanese attack at the same time with a formidable force. But once again, they didn't achieve it. Remember, this is the 5th Carrier Division, so they weren't as good pilots as the 1st and 2nd Divisions. But they did achieve some considerable success. What did they do? The Lexington took 2 torpedo hits and 2 bomb hits. And the Yorktown had a single bomb hit. The Japanese, seeing the flames, believed they'd actually crippled both carriers. Well, the results of that battle. The Lexington actually, although badly hit, the fuel tanks weren't properly protected, is the wrong word. You're supposed to flood the air above the avgas is what they call it, but we would call it aviation petrol fuel or something. You should flood above them with either carbon dioxide or with seawater. But they hadn't done that. And as a result, the explosions went into the fuel tanks. And when the fuel tanks started exploding, the ship was effectively doomed. And the aircraft on the ship were doomed as well. So Fletcher was left with 39 operational planes. The Yorktown with a bomb in it, but actually not too damaged, able to go back to Pearl Harbor for repair. And actually, it was repaired by 24-hour working in time for the Midway battle. And the Japanese, when they discovered it was there, were quite surprised. They thought they had sunk it. And the 2 Japanese carriers ended up with too few planes, so they couldn't actually take part in the Midway battle at all. Here is the tonnage lost and the aircrew lost. The Japanese lost 90 aircrew, and the United States lost 35. 1,000 men killed on the Japanese side, and so on. This was regarded as a Japanese tactical victory, but as we'll see, it was a strategic disaster for them. Now then, we're back up to Midway. And Operation AL takes 2 carriers. Operation MI was designed to have 6 carriers, but 2 of them are out of action. Now, what would you have done? Well, the answer is you abandon Aleutians, which is pretty irrelevant anyway, and you actually make sure that Midway succeeds, and you put 6 carriers there. That is not the Japanese way. If you have a plan, then that is the plan, and you stick to the plan. And although a lot of people had actually objected to the plan to attack Midway, and saying, once we've got it, what on earth how are we going to actually fuel it? Because we're going to be at the mercy of enemy submarines and so on. It's not going to work. But these people were the ones who had poo-pooed the idea of Pearl Harbor, which of course the Americans regarded as a success. And so they weren't going to be believed. But it was, as we'll see, 4 carriers was not enough to do the jobs expected of them, which was to neutralize Midway and to neutralize the American fleet. The best naval pilots in the world, with the best aircraft in the world, were on these 4 ships. 72 Zeros, 70 dive bombers, and 81 torpedo bombers. As you can see, roughly a third seemed to be the pattern, which was adopted mysteriously by both the Japanese and American navies. I'm not sure that our Navy did it as well. We had, of course, the Fairey Swordfish was our torpedo bomber, which succeeded in spite of itself. Now, this was their plan. Their plan was to have submarines in the bottom right there to actually detect when the Americans were coming. And then they had these complicated fleets. We had the first mobile striking force, the Kito-Butai, as they called it, and that was the two carrier divisions, the Carrier Division 1 and Carrier Division 2, the best carrier divisions in the world. The main body behind them were the battleships, because remember, the battleships were not to be too exposed. They were there to sort of mop up. So once the American carriers had been destroyed, the battleships would move in and destroy all the cruisers and destroyers that were accompanying. And here we've got the landing craft and the landing craft beside them. But the Americans knew they were coming. There was partly because they'd sort of broken the Japanese codes, certainly broken enough of them to be certain they were coming. And so the dispute was over where. And a man called, I think, is it Rochefort, was the signals man who was decoding there. And he wasn't being believed when he said they're coming to Midway. Washington said, no, they may be coming to Solomon Islands. So he decided to prove it. And the way he did it, it turned out to be a submarine cable from Pearl Harbor from Hawaii up to Midway. And so he sent a signal to them at Midway and said, send me a signal, in clear over the radio network to say that the desalination plant's broken down and you need repairs, please. So that was duly sent. Shortly afterwards, they got a Japanese signal that said, we need to add a desalination plant to our equipment. And that was the proof they needed. It was rather like, I suppose, Ultra in our war, when we used to drop things in known places and wait for the Germans to actually comment on it. The same sort of strategy, so very good. And of course, by now, the Americans were in place. And Task Force 17, now only with the Yorktown, because Lexington was sunk. And Task Force 16 under Spruance. Spruance wasn't supposed to be the admiral, it was supposed to be Halsey. But Spruance took over when Halsey was ill, or he had some skin disease, I think. That proved to be unfortunate, as we'll see. So Fletcher was in position. They'd repaired the damage on the Yorktown, and they were in position waiting. And the Japanese striking force came closer. And simultaneously, Midway, I should say, had been rearmed because they knew they were coming at some point. Planes had been sent to Midway. Unfortunately, they really only sent the planes they had, and some of them were Buffaloes. The Buffalo was obsolete, and anyone going up in a Buffalo, it was another death sentence. But it made it looked as if you were doing something. And doing something seemed to be an American disease as well as a Japanese disease. Anyway, the Americans, so when the Japanese attacked, there were no planes on the ground in Midway. They were en route to attack the Japanese fleet. And the Japanese attacked Midway, no planes there, and it wasn't a particularly successful strike. Tominaga led it. And Tominaga radioed back afterwards and said that we're going to have to do this again. We've got to neutralize it so the landing force don't get destroyed on their way. So we've actually got to destroy what remains on Midway before the landing force can get anywhere near it. And you can see the Japanese attacked with 108 aircraft, and 17 were lost. 26 were damaged and got back, but they were pretty well lost as well. The American had 18 aircraft in the fighter defense, and they lost all but 3. Now, timing is important now. Midway aircraft started to attack the Japanese carriers. Now, one of the problems they had was they didn't know where the carriers were. They knew approximately because they'd had a sighting, and they then had to plot where they're likely to be. Now, not one of the aircraft from Midway radioed back the actual location of the Japanese. It's inexplicable, isn't it? But I suppose they're all, the Japanese as well as the Americans, they were all bound by this concept of keeping radio silence. There's no point in keeping radio silence when you can see the enemy and they can see you. So they did not radio back the location of the Japanese carriers. So the American carriers had to work out where they were. And they did this with varying degrees of success. Basically, they sent them too far to the east of the gap because they assumed the Japanese carriers would carry on at the same speed. But of course, they're being attacked by Midway's aircraft. So they were doing evasive maneuvers. And so they had to go backwards and forwards. They had to dodge bombs. They made absolutely no progress at all. And in fact, instead of going east, as was predicted, they went north. So a lot of the planes were on the wrong path. And when they got to where they're supposed to be, they had to make a decision. And some of them thought, well, the enemy is probably to the left. Perhaps they'd gone a bit faster than we thought. A foolish decision. And they ended up by landing on Midway. Well, most of them landed on Midway. Some of them saw the smoke there from the burning oil tanks and decided they'd try and get back to their carrier, and they failed and they drowned. But the ones that landed on Midway were able to actually take off and take part in the battle the next day. So the first attack, 10 torpedoes, bombers went in, and they went in with no escorts. Now, why? It's because Spruance, an inexperienced admiral, and admittedly America was learning how to do this, decided he was going to commit all his planes in the first shot. Now, that mistake was they were not good at launching their planes. The Japanese could launch nearly 100 planes in an hour. The Americans only launched a third of their planes in the first hour. And the planes were all circling, waiting. The torpedo bombers were the slowest. So they were the ones that actually were launched first. And the idea is you launch torpedo bombers first, then the dive bombers, and then the fighters at the end, so that because they're the fastest. And then they all arrive on target at the same time. You can follow the logic. But of course, what Spruance decided, because he's trying to get everything in the air at the same time, I mean, that's foolish. He said to the torpedoes, well, you better go ahead. They went ahead with no fighting escort, and guess what happened? No, it was absolutely tragic. 2/3 of the planes were just shot down, and not a single torpedo got to a target. But Nagumo orders the rearming of his bombers, because the torpedo bombers need to have bombs to attack Midway, and the dive bombers needed to have fragmentation bombs rather than armor-piercing bombs. So he ordered the changeover of all the ordnance on these bombers so he could attack Midway. Now, he knew it was a risk, but he knew also the Americans were unaware until now of the Japanese fleet being there. How could they be aware? And so it was a risk that was worth taking to get Midway neutralized and keep up with his landing timetable. Remember, everything's driven by timetables. So he orders the rearming of his torpedo bombers and bombers. The Americans now sent in more bombers, and 16 dive bombers went in and 11 were lost. And they were launching their torpedoes way far out because, of course, the anti-aircraft fire and the Zeros attacking them prevented them getting anywhere near. They sent flying fortresses in. These flying fortresses could fly at 20,000 feet, which meant that they were above the anti-aircraft gunfire, but also meant that they had to drop their bombs, rather from a height, and of course none of them hit. And of the 11 dive bombers, 6 were lost. And the scout at this point reports the presence of the US carrier force. Nagumo has a bit of a problem now, because he's busy rearming all of his planes with the wrong stuff to attack carriers. So what should he do? Should he send an immediate strike with the wrong ordnance, or should he recover Tomonaga's aircraft, or should he rearm his bombers, or should he land Tomonaga's aircraft first? And of course, he didn't have a choice, because Tomonaga's aircraft, coming back from Midway, only had half an hour's fuel left, and it was unthinkable to actually condemn them to a watery grave before the battle had started. So it was going to take 60 minutes, at least, to rearm and get the planes ready for flight. So there was no real choice. Nagumo had to choose to fight. But at the bottom, he chose an unwise course. And by that, I mean the course he chose to steer in a nautical sense. He chose to steer towards the enemy carriers. Now, that was his mistake, because the Japanese had longer range. Far better for him to actually steer away from the American carriers, to give them a longer range to fly to hit him, and to give him more time to actually recover. And so that's a fairly inexplicable mistake, and it's the big one that Nagumo made. Now let me talk to you about how you're supposed to do this. The carrier defense procedure is you have fighters circling around your carrier group. And they are fighters, and they're the Combat Air Patrol, sometimes called the CAP. You also have cruisers and destroyers in position round your carrier force, and they're there to provide anti-aircraft fire. And also, while you can't see dive bombers coming, well, you can't do much maneuvering, you can maneuver out of the way of torpedoes if you can see them coming towards you. So that was the defense procedure for carriers. Now, the attack procedure. Torpedo bombers cannot go in at high level, because the torpedoes would shatter when they hit the ground. They can only go in at, 500 to 1,000 feet. So when they launch their torpedoes in a very horizontal way, they actually then go into the water to attack the enemy ships. But the plan is to do a scissors attack. The idea is you come from both left and right. And so if the carrier tries to steer out of the way of one line of torpedoes, they're steering into the direction of the other one. And so that's how your torpedoes will succeed. You've got fighters are there to protect them, and your dive bombers don't need the fighter protection because they're flying high. And they're going to dive from 20,000 feet. It was pretty uncomfortable because they weren't pressurized, but it was what they had to endure to do it. And they flew at 20,000 feet and dive bombed from there. So you can see that the key is to get the coordination right. So all three groups come in at the same time. And that's what the Americans signally failed to do at every stage of this battle. Yes, as I said earlier, Task Force 16, his launching is absolute shambles. He launched all the planes in one attack, and the first plane sent out, none with fighter cover. The target route was plotted so badly that some went due south to attack, some went, would you believe, due west, and it's called the flight to nowhere. But of course, it was early days of carrier warfare. But some US carrier attacks did find the enemy, and these were torpedo bombers from the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown. And from the Hornet, all 15 planes were lost. From the Enterprise, 20 out of 24 were lost. And from the Yorktown, 10 out of 12 were lost. I mean, absolutely catastrophic, but absolutely in line with the bombers that went to bomb the carriers in Coral Sea. But there was a benefit. First of all, the attacks caused a breakup of the battle formation. But Nagumo was in 10 minutes of being able to launch his counterstrike. But luck finally favors the Americans. A man called McCluskey led one of the fighter groups that went to the east of the carriers. And he didn't turn right or left, he went straight on, which was not a clever idea because it meant he didn't have enough fuel to get home. But he then turned to the right, well, to starboard. And then when he turned right, he saw a destroyer's wake. And the destroyer had been looking for an American submarine and was now rejoining the carrier group. And so McCluskey worked out that wherever this destroyer was pointing, that's where he'd find the carrier group. And so he followed it, and he came to the carrier group. He came there at the same time as Leslie came from Yorktown. The Yorktown had plotted the position of the Japanese carriers correctly. But they weren't able to launch their strikes earlier because they had the scout planes out looking for the Japanese carriers. So theirs went out later. But it so happened that both McCluskey's two squadrons and Leslie's squadron arrived over the Japanese ships at the same time. One ship, the Hiryu, was hidden by cloud, but the other three ships were all visible and moderately scattered. And McCluskey took the first two. Actually, he took the first one, but his wingman decided that they were doing so well with the first one, he would disobey orders and he'd attack the second one. And they scored hits on both of these. And Leslie, with the Yorktown dive bombers, scored hits on the third. Now, the Japanese were at their most vulnerable. They'd been changing their bombs over, and they'd not stored the bombs which had been taken off. They were still lying around in the hangars, waiting to be stored. The planes were on deck, all fully fueled and fully armed. When the bombs landed, it was like a tinderbox, and everything just went up. All three carriers were to sink within 12 hours, with a fairly large loss of life, not huge because they took time to sink, and it was possible to remove the emperor's statue and painting and all that sort of stuff, which the Japanese were quite keen on. But all three of these carriers are destroyed. Now it's one carrier against three. The Hiryu was the one carrier remaining. Now, this was the one fleet carrier remaining that was active. And any sensible decision by Yamamoto should have been for that carrier to withdraw. Because if it withdrew, it was there to fight another day. If it was going to fight against three American carriers, it was extremely likely it wasn't going to survive. And so what it should have done is withdraw. But I can understand that, your blood's up. You've seen the damage done to your three sister ships. You want to get your revenge. And so the Hiryu launches its dive bombers and with 6 zeros. And 18 of the Enterprise, McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers, ran out of fuel as they returned. Yorktown dive bombers, of course, did better, but they led the Japanese back to the Yorktown. On their way to the Yorktown, the Japanese wildcats spotted some of the American planes returning, and they were the dive bombers, and they decided to attack them. That turned out to be quite a mistake for two reasons. One was the dive bombers without their bombs turned out to be extremely flexible aircraft and quite fast. And also they had machine gunners in this. Remember, it's got a crew of 2, and the pilot plus a machine gunner at the back. And so many of these zeros were destroyed, and so not able to protect the torpedo bombers going in to attack the Yorktown. And after Yorktown was hit by 3 bombs, but only 5 dive bombers and 1 zero returned to their ship. So they lost 75% of their planes in this attack. They then did a second attack on the Yorktown. And this time, they were told the Yorktown is dead in the water because they've seen all the flames and stuff. So don't attack a carrier that's dead in the water and burning. Find a carrier which actually is not burning. And so what they did was they looked for a carrier that's not dead in the water. By now, the damage control of the Yorktown had actually got the ship up to 24 knots. They got the fires extinguished, and it was actually operational again. And the Japanese, guess what? They found the same carrier. And so they attacked it. And they attacked it with 10 Kate bombers and 6 zero fighters to protect it. Okay, and yes, dead in the water. And you can see here the second attack on the Yorktown with very fierce anti-aircraft fire going up from all the surrounding cruisers. And the Japanese lost 9 out of their 16 planes. So that was a 56% loss rate. But they actually did land 2 more torpedoes on the Yorktown, and the Yorktown was thought to be doomed, and they ordered the evacuation of the Yorktown. But the Hiru's ending was about to come, because the Yorktown had discovered where they were, and they sent their bombers out to attack the Hiru. Now, of course, it had almost no planes left, because they'd all been lost in all these different attacks. And so effectively, the dive bombers from both the Yorktown and from the Enterprise were able to attack the Hiru, and it got hit and it sank as well. So the Japanese, in about 12 hours, had lost their 4 top carriers and all of their planes. Yamamoto took some time to take it in. Although this arrow shows him retreating, he didn't retreat for about another 24 hours. He actually decided to go in and try and provoke the Americans to attack. But of course, the Americans were having none of that. They destroyed this carrier force. He also wanted to get the carriers back from the Aleutians to get them back. But they were 2 days sailing away. So in the end, they worked out that there's no point in carrying on, and they made the decision to turn about. So here are the losses. The Americans lost 144 planes and 210 airmen. Why 210? Because, of course, torpedo bombers carry a crew of 3, a pilot, a rear gunner, and a bomb aimer. And the Zeros, fighters only carry a crew of one. Okay, so the Japanese lost fewer airmen, partly because they were all on the carriers, but they lost a huge number of men for that. There was another cruiser sunk later. The Yorktown was sunk eventually because they decided it didn't sink when they expected it to. So they put a boarding party aboard and started to tow it back to Pearl Harbor. They discovered it had been very strongly made and could have survived. But unfortunately, the Japanese sent a submarine in, and that submarine torpedoed it and also torpedoed the destroyer beside it that was providing it with electricity at the time. So that was the casualties, was the Hammerman destroyer as well as the Yorktown. Some people say that the Yorktown, the Midway, was the battle that decided the future of the war. Of course, it wasn't. The Americans were going to win that war eventually because their industrial strength was going to completely outdo the Japanese. But what it certainly did was it stopped Japanese expansion. Up till that point, the Japanese had been on the attack. From this point on, the Japanese were on the defensive. Thank you. Now, some in the audience actually probably know more than I do, looking at Jock and 1 or 2 others. But I'm happy to try and answer any question. Then, question there, sorry.
Okay, I feel. Thanks first of all, which I said, I'm sure we all did. You mentioned in passing some aspects of naval ship construction. From memory, I think that the Japanese carriers and the American carriers have different construction of flight ships. Do you think the construction of both Navy ships played any part in the eventual loss?
Absolutely right. Yeah. So the question was, the Japanese construction of their carriers was different from the Americans. They had unprotected hangars. So once a flame hit one end of the hangar, it went all the way along. And that was part of the problems when they had a bomb hit it. You're quite right. Their construction was not as good. It got better later.
Did they have, were their flight decks made of material?
Now, the British had steel flight decks, which meant that when the kamikaze bombers hit them, they actually were able to brush them off the side. The Americans had wooden flight decks. And I think the Japanese must have had the same, very lightly armored if they had flight decks at all. There's a similar case with the aeroplanes. They were not built to be rugged to take punishment. They were built for speed, really, for Zero.
I would say, Hamish, I think there's another dimension to this victory, which is that the numbers of aircrew, one of the things the Americans had, even from the outset, and of course it only got better and better, was the numbers of aircrew they had. And the Japanese did not. And one of the things the Americans were able to do, not at this stage, but later, was to rotate aircrew so that they didn't have people fighting for 3 years solid. Whereas the Japanese did, and it was always with the Japanese diminishing asset as well.
Yes. Jock's making the point that Americans had far more resources and they put far more into training as well. And in fact, one of the things I haven't mentioned is that on some of these occasions, the Japanese were very tired. They'd been flying all day and they thought about flying at night as well. It had been a very punishing, even short time for them. But I don't think that affected, no, pilots didn't affect the result of Midway. That was a longer term thing. Sorry, another question at the back.
Just curious, having lost the fourth carrier, do you know, presumably there were still aeroplanes in the air, did they know anywhere to go?
They had nowhere to go.
They just,
Yeah. Presumably, they'd have tried to attack the Americans to get what revenge they could. Yes. Sorry, that was a question. I should have repeated the question. It's for our Zoom audience who can't perhaps hear. But it was what happened to the planes still in the air when the Hiryu got sunk. They had nowhere to go. The Hiru had taken some of the other planes from the other carriers earlier. That's correct. Are there any online questions? Mary?
There aren't at the moment, no.
Yes. A question here.
Just a simple clarification here. Am I right in thinking that the Battle of the Coral Sea was the first ever naval battle where neither fleet ever saw each other?
Yes, Peter. The question was the Coral Sea the first battle when none of the ships could see each other? And it absolutely was, yes, the first carrier battle. Yeah. I think we're there.
Are we there?
Yes.
Right. Hello everybody here and hello everybody on Zoom. That's my normal position, is looking after all the Zoom people from my home. So I'm very used to seeing people pop up, and of course Hamish at the end would normally do a massive thank you. Now I have the honour today to say thank you to Hamish for, I think we'll all agree, a wonderful talk, a clear talk, an emotive talk, a factual talk. And I have to say that when I saw the heading, the Coral Sea and Midway, I'm sorry, I had no idea at all. But now I do, so thank you, Hamish, well done, very good. More than that, Hamish is the father of the festival. And without him, there would be no festival, there would be no talks, there would be no concerts. Enormous amount of people support him, Will, and all the wonderful technical people, Adrian and Jerry. Is it Jerry? Sorry?
Gary.
Gary, sorry, Gary, wherever you are. And, you know, all these people have been brought in this year to really bring Haslemere back to life. And I have to say the Zoom has been absolutely fabulous, because we've had people from all over the world watching. And sometimes they've watched them later. But more often, they've actually watched them online. We had somebody watching the Battle of the Somme from Australia at 4 o'clock in the morning. So, you know, this is the sort of thing where Haslemere is really spreading its wings, purely thanks to Hamish and his hard work, putting the brochure together, persuading people to do their talks for as little as possible, mostly for nothing. And the likes of us running about supporting, which we're very, very happy to do. So Hamish, on behalf of us all, I'd like to give you a little something to say thank you for everything that you've done. Thank you very much indeed. Great hand for Hamish.
One of them somebody's Scottish.
Well, it is. But we don't stop there, because behind every good man there's a good woman, Linda. Come on. Here we are seeing people, they're rather beautiful. Lovely. So thank you to everyone who's come today. You don't want to say anything, do you, Hamish? No, he's done. There's still a few bits and pieces left on the festival, not so much now, we're coming towards the end, but some very exciting talks still and some wonderful concerts. So have a look, late bookings, we love them. And hopefully see you all in 2 years' time, if not before. Thank you very much.